Cool. All right. Well, hello, everybody. This is the last wave of presentations for the day at CMS Philly. I'm Mike Crawford. I'm a technical architect at Hero Digital, and I'm going to present a talk on using Twig in WordPress to enhance the editor experience. So you could be here because you're interested in Twig, WordPress, or the editing experience. I want to thank you for attending. You probably worked on WordPress before. It's a very popular system. If not, you've at least heard of it. But have you heard of Twig? I'm not going to go into detail about how to code in Twig, but I'm going to share with you how I'm currently working to streamline our development workflow to create time for creating an intuitive method for editors to edit their content. Today we've seen a bunch of presentations about building components and streamlining that process and using design tools to help that process, but no one's ever talked about the editing experience. And that's what this is going to be about. I'm not sure what was going on before the Big Bang, but afterwards, the history of humanity has had many ages. We're currently living in the information age. Managing web content is an important part of sharing information in this age. Because businesses assign people to keep this information current, they need to use a system that assists in their efforts. A key element in this system is rendering the content on the screen, different sizes of screens, to different audiences. There's a lot that can go into the rendering of each page. But before we get there, the page is designed. There's research that goes into what the page is going to look like for the site visitor. The team spends months working with the client to get just the right flow. They have in-person meetings, if you can remember them, and give names to all the features and elements in the designs. The client signs off on these designs, and the developer builds the new pages using templates. The developer will reuse templates to display new content for each page request. The URL is the web request that contains parameters. The CMS will translate the URL and request the correct content from the database. Then it renders the page. These pages are rendered using static templates. Templates you could build with PHP, or you can build them with Twig. Twig is a modern template engine for PHP. It helps us to separate our logic from layout. It was originally created by Armin Ronachur in 2007 to work with Python. It's now maintained by the Symfony project. Twig was adopted by Drupal with the release of version 8. And then an initiative was made to upgrade the core code of Drupal by integrating key elements of the Symfony framework. Now it's available on WordPress through the installation of the Timber plugin. I've built a lot of sites and have inherited quite a few. I've seen and done things. These things may not be ideal, but at the time they worked. As we build newer and better things, we learn how to evolve. There's a community of developers building better things all the time. These are wonderful things that make our lives easier. Twig is making my life easier. Starting the summer of 2008, I was thinking of ways to streamline our WordPress development to work more like Drupal. We just launched a great Drupal 8 site, but I kept getting these WordPress projects assigned to me. Then I was asked to help a team who were trying to launch a Drupal 8 site, and they were out of time. They needed to go live, and they needed help. When they showed me what they set up, I was impressed. The front-end team had set up all their CSS and JavaScript and HTML in the theme without any back-end processing. The backend merely loaded the correct template. All the requests processed through AJAX that were pointing to a static file. They just needed to connect the backend processing and replace the hard-coded AJAX calls. After we launched the site, I continued to think about how they set up their front end. They used Twig and JavaScript with Node PHP to build out a dynamic page. They did this all in a headless way, then integrated it with Drupal. I wanted to do this on all my projects. I found Timber and decided it could work, making WordPress more like Drupal one step at a time. I learned a lot of good habits and best practices using Drupal. From my experiences in WordPress, it's less important. Each dev has their own style and preference, which is cool, and I learn from them. But it's also an opportunity for me to define my style and preference. And I have a rule: put your logic in a plugin. My test is to be able to switch themes, but retain all the functionality. It's a nerdy test, but it enforces the separation of logic from display. Speaking of nerdy, here's the code that makes up WordPress. Very streamlined. If you've never worked in it, there's only one directory that is important for this presentation: WP-content. This is the directory where you put your plugin and your themes. Here's the code representation of logic and layout. Plugins represent the logic of returning the dynamic content for our templates. Themes represent the layout, returning templates rendered with dynamic content. To start, download and install the Timber library to give WordPress the ability to process Twig templates. While our entire team needs to participate in building WordPress sites, not everyone knows the ins and outs of the loop, codecs, and PHP, nor should they. With Timber, your back-end developer can focus on building PHP files. The front-end developer can configure their Sass, scripts, and task runners however they are familiar. The theme's template directory contains all of your Twig templates. These pretty much correspond one-to-one with the PHP files that you would expect. If you're familiar with WordPress theming, the template structure should look very familiar. Start project with a simple base theme provided by the Timber plugin, the Timber Starter theme. Each theme will contain your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that matches a specific design. I feel the way the developers sell their packaged themes with features contributes to the combination of logic and layout within WordPress. And that may work for people who just want to install and go. But by separating the logic from layout, we make development easier. A front-end developer who works with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript will rarely need to touch a plugin, and a back-end developer will rarely need to modify the theme. This eliminates a lot of conflicts within the code. In addition to making the project you're working on better, using Twig makes it easier to share your components with other CMSs too that use Twig, like Drupal. Now, I want to talk about the editors. I love the editors. They're the people I'm building the site for, not the marketing execs, but the editors. In my projects, nobody thinks about the editors. The designers target the visitors of the site. The project managers focus on the client, and the rest of the team work to make sure that design works correctly as HTML. It isn't until the client starts to add content does anyone start to think about the editor. And at this point, it's too late to do anything since the budget is spent and we're at the end of our timeline. Site launches and looks great. Then the editor has to update a page. They want to post that new fancy content block with the image and the button, but can't figure out which one it is and how to do it. So they call up the developers to make the changes to the site. This defeats the purpose of making a CMS if you aren't going to manage your own content. Most people on our teams are visual thinkers and don't consider the nuances of a CMS when designing a page. They don't need to learn Drupal or WordPress, but I'd like them to be able to post new content in their design if they ever decide they want to log in. The designers run the projects from a requirements standpoint. I think it makes sense to continue to facilitate the design focus. To do this, we build out the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to match the design first, without giving them the ability to edit content. After we make sure all the requirements are met with the designers, we work on the admin UI piece. This also helps with digital production and timing. We don't have to train digital production to create all the pages until after we've gotten through our design review process. This gives us time after the design review to really think through editing the content for digital production to build out the rest of the site. Our projects tend to have two developers, one for the front end and the other for the back end. We often get allocated a large number of hours for our work over the course of the project. Reality has us spending all of the time in the first week. As the back-end developer, I end up being a bottleneck for everyone because the front-end developer needs their templates and the digital production team, they need to add their content. To buy myself time, I set up the templates and let the front-end developer design the HTML however they like. And that includes the content for digital production. The front-end developer can put their class names and IDs where they like. They can set up their images the way they like. They don't have to inherit any HTML from a CMS. The rendered page will match the design documents exactly, even with the content. This eliminates the need for digital production at this time because the content's already on the page. I'm no longer a bottleneck. We save time on digital production. Front end can build exactly what they need, and design will be able to see their creation quickly. So I'm going to show you the same site in 3 different stages of development. The HTML stage will show you how we can start quick out the gate. The Twig stage will show you how we start to analyze the data and construct our data objects. The admin UI stage will show you how we customize the administration experience for the editors. We have a base theme in place, and the front-end engineer configures the theme with Compass or Gulp. All they need now are some templates for the new page components. I like to create a components directory in the template directory of the theme for these Twig files. In our last project, the front-end developer started before I did and created their own templates in this directory. This highlights how this process removes the back end from being a bottleneck by giving the front end everything they need to start. We can get a finished visual product to the designers to review sooner. To render the template on the page, we need to include our Twig templates. We do this with a single file that includes all our Twig component files. We include them in the order specified by the design. This is the component mapping template. Its function is to list all the available Twig templates and render them on the page. Once we have the mapping file, we need to load it into our page.twig template. We do this by including the component Twig file in the page.twig file, and we comment out the post content that is typically displayed. With this technique, every page will look exactly the same because our templates are hard-coded HTML, but that doesn't matter in the HTML stage. And this is our rendered page. In Drupal, these components are best built with paragraphs. The UI is straightforward, and you can export the finished result in configuration or feature to share with the changes and deploy for staging. In WordPress, I build these components as field groups using advanced custom fields. I set up a custom field group named Shared Components and post all the components into the group, all of them, regardless of which post types they will be used on. This helps us organize our components and share functionality across post types. Initially, we don't add any fields to these components. They are just shells to allow us to assign a template to a page. Another technique I want to mention, I also don't assign this custom group to any post types. The shared field group is only meant to store the canonical components on the site. In Drupal, we add paragraph bundles to the system, not to a content type. This confused me at first, but after using it, it made much more sense. In each content type, you associate which of the paragraphs from the system you want to be available. It's sharing all the components from a centralized location. To recreate this in WordPress, we use this shared component field group as the centralized location. For each post type that has a distinct set of components, I create additional field groups to assign the specific components. Now we're working on the page post type. In this new field group for the page, we need to create one flexible content field labeled components. The flexible content fields are cool, as they let the editor pick from a variety of different options. You add the options to the flexible content field by adding what we refer to as layouts. To get our shared components into this flexible list of layouts, we clone each component from our shared list. When you clone them, it creates a reference of the object. If you change a field, label, or value in the shared component, then the same will also be changed in every clone location. That's another huge benefit of centralizing your components. It makes things easier later when things change, and they do. It's good to be prepared. To reiterate, the flexible content field allows you to add layouts to the component field. Each layout is going to be a cloned field group from the shared components library. Twigification is what I call this stage. Can you blame me? This step involves replacing all dynamic elements in the template with Twig variables. Any value that can change between pages needs to be replaced. Titles, subtitles, class names, rich text, and image locations are all things that will change when we request a different page. We carefully extract all the dynamic strings and create a data array in Twig to store them. Actually, they call it a hash in Twig. It's easy with Twig's set command. Label the value of each element in the hash to relate to the location where you grabbed it. Then add a Twig variable where the string was that references the hash value. Here's an example of a Twigified HTML page. It doesn't matter if it's a title, a class, or a class name. All these strings will be data that get passed into the template. Once we have the data object that represents all the dynamic elements, we need to set up a way for WordPress to dynamically update them. To do this, we're going to put our data in a plugin and pass it into our Twig templates. By delaying our work building the admin UI, we give ourselves an opportunity to evaluate each component individually as a whole. It's a chance to catch similar components and tie them into the same template. This doesn't mean the UI has to use the same component. With this process, we're able to map any number of components in the UI to the same Twig template. As an experiment, I often create one monster Twig template. That's an aggregate of all the other Twig templates we build for a project. The monster Twig file is what I see as being the single template necessary to start any site, but it's a very complicated beast, and I've yet to implement it. this is the only time in Twigification where we're going to touch PHP file in the theme. We need to modify the post object before it gets sent to the Twig template. To do this, we add a hook alter to the page PHP file. In this case, it's called HD post types alter context. This filter passes the post object to a method in a custom plugin. The post object is processed and modified to include our new data objects for our templates. I typically use the same plugin used for defining post types and categories. In this plugin, I'll add the hook alter. This method will accept the post object and look at the values in the component field of the page. All components associated to the current page will be processed through a switch case statement. If the case matches the layout, then the data will be saved to the post object. In the Twigification phase, these case statements contain hard-coded data objects that we created in the initial Twigification. Each layout option will be a case in our switch statement and connect to the clone components in the flexible content field to our post object, which will eventually allow us to build our admin and pass the values into the data objects to replace our hard-coded values. We're processing a page post type, which means we're going to use a page template to render the output. We already created the component Twig mapping file in the first step and placed it in the page Twig template. Now we're going to add some conditionals based on the post object we updated with our hook alter. This allows us to control from the admin UI by dragging and dropping specific components into the component field, which HTML components appear on the page. We can set up multiple pages in WordPress that have different sets of components. You can't change the content on a component displayed on the page yet, but you have the ability to place the Twig template on the page. In my dreams, at this point, the project is way ahead of schedule. The design team's already looking at their work in HTML form. They can click and navigate through a few of the sample pages they designed. In my dreams, again, they have time to now add some fancy JavaScript interaction that they didn't think they'd be able to have time for. The editors still can't edit the page, but they aren't allocated to work on this project yet. For all the visual members of our team who will never log into the site, this project is over. But what about the editors? They need some representation. Now that we all have the data in one place, in consistently structured objects, we're able to evaluate the best way to provide a UI for easily recreating these pages. In our Twigification stage, we were able to evaluate our templates to find ones that were similar and consolidate them into one. Here, we have another chance to streamline our code. This doesn't limit what we can do in the admin UI, but it does make changes easier because there are less places to make them. Additionally, additional components can also be simplified. We often get requests for new components that are actually slight variations of the existing ones. These become very easy to recreate and allows us to spend more time thinking about how to create top-notch admin UI for the editors. At this point of the project, the client is clamoring to access the system to start posting content. They wanted this since the first day you started dev because they started this project 6 months ago. But you haven't built the admin pieces. Front-end engineering is done, the design team is done, digital production is about to start, and you need your admin finished. Fortunately, you've been planning and working towards this moment. Advanced Custom Fields has a lot of really nice elements that help you enhance the editor experience. The first question you need to answer is about the type of editor you're going to support. Are they the user who wants to control every aspect, or do they just want it to look like the design? If they want to control every aspect, you have more work to do. You need to set up all the fields with controls for changing class names and margins. You need to let them add one or many images and pick how they're handled with galleries and slideshows. It can get intense. But if you expect this, you can do it. More likely, they just need to match the design. To handle this, we set up an initial options field. This field will list the options as defined by the design document. For example, you could have a project that has 8 different post types. Each post type has a page hero. Each hero has a different style, but they contain almost the same content. We use one component called hero with an option field that lists out your different options based on the design. The design team reviewed these options with the client. They have names like full bleed hero, video hero with subnav, or they could be named for the post type that they're associated to. The option field will list the options the editor is expecting based on the design they're familiar. If these are used consistently, they have a better chance of knowing what each option will provide. When the editor picks the option, we use conditionals to determine which fields to present to them. By limiting the fields, you simplify the UI for the editor. They only need to have data for the fields presented to them. They fill them in, then their page should meet their expectation. What if the editor changes their mind? They didn't want the hero option they selected, but they want to try a different one. By grouping all the similar design components into one component option, you use the same fields for all the different heroes. If the editor wants to see a different hero if they want to see what a different hero looks like, they don't have to delete the old one. They can just change their option. The data stays in the fields associated with the component. If you have a component with a lot of field options, it can get overwhelming when you first add the component to the page. Using conditionals help limit the field until you need them. In addition to grouping fields with accordions or tabs is also a great way to organize fields. You have to admit, having the ability to add components in any order gives the editor a lot of flexibility, but this could also be very daunting to an editor who doesn't use the system much and wants to build a very specific layout that was part of the original designs. I assume everyone on the project thinks visually. The designers are driving the requirements, and we want to stay in sync with the way they think. So we need a quick way to assign a certain stack of components to a page for these editors. We do this with quick links. These links will allow an editor to click on a single link that is programmed to preload components with options to easily give them a starting point for creating new content. Once they click the link, WordPress will create the new post for them. Then add the predefined stack of components in order. The editing page is displayed with all the options collapsed and ready for the editor to fill in. They don't have to select components or drag them into position. I love the editors. They are my target. With this technique, we're looking to build consistent components across sites, but allow our designers complete flexibility in what it's going to look like. Each time we build them, we learn new techniques that we want to carry over to the next time we build this. I'm looking forward to continuing to build with Twig to streamline our workflow. I'm planning to work on developing a consistent library of Twig templates that we can reuse across WordPress and Drupal. And I'm super stoked for Drupal 9. About me, technical architect at Hero Digital. I've been working on Drupal since version 4.6. I've been working on WordPress since Drupal 4.8. And I've been trying to integrate a lot of the features and elements that I've come to like with Drupal within WordPress. And the biggest challenges that we've had in our projects has been about timing. It's been about the design team spending 6 months working with the client, defining the requirements for the visitor of the site, but spending 0 time for the editors. And then in our estimates, when we start working on the projects, our build time, we estimate how long it's going to take us to actually build what the design's produced. And if they don't produce anything for the editor, then we don't have any time for that. So this process is meant to give us some time to work through all the different components that are added in the original design, get added during development, get added at the end when the client starts looking at things, and gives us a system to flexibly modify our back-end piece so that it doesn't become spaghetti code filled with a bunch of different fields just because they wanted a new component. We're actually leveraging the structure that we created to reuse these pieces within WordPress to facilitate the editor's experience. So that's pretty much my presentation. I tried to keep it short and sweet. If you could tell, I scripted the entire thing. I have a tendency to ramble and get on track, lose track and lose my point. I think I really conveyed the message that I was trying to convey. But if we have any questions, I would be willing to answer them now. Don't know if anybody has any. And I'm just going to hang out for a couple minutes and see if anybody has anything they want to ask. I enjoyed presenting this. This was a goal of mine for this year, was to make a presentation. I was really hoping to do it in person. I think that's kind of more of the challenge for me. I don't usually do a lot of presentations, so I really enjoyed working on this, putting it together, and I think I've benefited by having it be remote.
Yeah, thank you for presenting. We appreciate it, despite a short notice.
Right on.
Are you going to upload this online if we want to look at the slide again?
I can. I hadn't thought of that, but
Yeah,
I definitely
you should probably upload it to Slack.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do that.
Mm-hmm.
The only other
Also, the audience is unmuted if they want to ask questions with their mic.
Oh, great. I'm gonna knock out of that, and I'm gonna pull up my page. So while we're here, what I did was I set up 3 versions of the website. I've got an HTML version. I also have a Twig version, and then I have the finished CMS version. And the way I did this was I actually went back in our repository and checked out old copies of things. So I'm applying the old CSS. I'm applying old CSS to the pages and new CSS, so it kind of changes along the way. But I didn't update that. But in each of these pages, if I click edit in HTML1, it actually made a lot more progress, and you can actually drag and drop and change the order of these components. If you open it, there is nothing inside of it. Everything is going to be hard-coded inside the template, but dragging and dropping these will actually change the layout of the page. And what this does is it gives us the ability to build out different pages it allows us to build out different pages and map different data to them. So if we had, for instance, two different, here's the Twig one with fields. Yeah, here's one with fields. But as you saw, this one did not have fields. But if we, lost my, I'm gonna go to custom fields. And you can see my shared component and my dynamic component library. And they get associated. Not what happened on that page. But let's see these guys here. Like this one. It's got stuff. So these are the pieces. So as we build this, as we Twigify, we have the ability to start building the HTML, or start building the UI, so that in the end it's not as daunting for us to manage it. And in this particular project, I didn't have a lot of time to clean it up, but in this presentation, I did go in and kind of start playing around with the field options we have and some conditionals and tabs and groupings that you can use to organize your content. So I started out with this little layout type field, which is going to toggle your layout options. So if you're basing your editor on the designs, and they build a design called announcements, they build one that are called specific things, like they're going to name these components in these designs, and the design team and everyone else on the team and the client, that's what they know them as. And a lot of times these names change when you get to the editor. So I try and keep the names consistent throughout that whole process. And this option style really facilitates that. So you can build these options, and then you can have conditionals that will show different fields based on the option you pick. Whether you do a video or whether there's going to be a video option available to the editor or not. You can hide and show those fields. It really facilitates it for the editor who, they touch it every once in a while, or they work on a bunch of different sites. It makes it really intuitive for them to come in and work with this. But you also have clients who they want to have control of everything. They don't want to use predefined design systems. They just want to create something special for themselves. In that case, you need to add a lot more custom fields to it, but they also benefit from toggling with conditionals so that you're not presented with every option when you load the page, but you can conditionally select them to interact with them. This goes the same with multiples of things. I've seen where you have columns, and the designers will build the same component, but it'll be 5 different versions based on the number of columns that are there. And I don't want to build templates that represent that, because then I have 5 different templates that are really doing the exact same thing. I like to have one template that really can render any number of columns and handle that logic for them. So the UI can be a lot, the UI, it has a lot of flexibility. You can build it however you want. It's the maintainability of the code on the back end. Having to manage 10 components is a lot easier than having to manage 45 components. And I've inherited sites that the developers were in a position where they had to build each component as it was designed. So in the end, they had 45 components, and the editor, when they clicked on add component, they were presented with 45 different options. And a lot of times they're not grouped well, they're alphabetical, and they're really hard to follow. But when you set them up and you have time to think through what templates you're going to have and what the UI is going to be, you have a chance to clean that up on the back end and clean it up on the editor side. So your back end code is only going to be a few templates that you have to manage, And the alter, where you can massage the data that gets passed from the admin UI, and then you can customize the admin UI. And the result is just something better for the editor. And I really focus on being the representation for that editor so that they're able to modify their site effectively. So that's my rant and presentation. I will upload the slides, and I appreciate everyone who attended, and thank you very much. And that's all I'm going to say. Do we need anything to do to close this out?
No. It will close by itself if everyone leaves. Yeah.
All right. Do I just leave?
Yeah, you can leave if you're finished, and if the audience doesn't have any questions, well.
Nope, I got nothing from anybody. We got 3 people now. More people are leaving. Cool. All good.
Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate it so much.
Right on. No, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.